Today I'm sharing a full-length brisket trim video at normal speed with minimal edits. I'm going to walk you through what I'm doing and thinking in real time, just as if you were standing here next to me as I do it. So let's get into it. Today we're working with an 18-pound brisket that I picked up from Costco. I'm now wearing cut gloves on both hands just to be extra careful. I unfortunately cut my hand early this year. It was a stupid mistake, but I was out of commission for a while and it sucked. I'm also wearing nitrile gloves over my cut gloves to keep the cut gloves clean. I'll wash the cut gloves after every use. I'm using a 4-inch utility knife and a 10-inch slicer for this trim. They're sharp, but I like to hone them before I start working, and potentially a few more times throughout the trim, and definitely between briskets. I open the package by cutting along the decal fat on the meat side. I'm going to remove this fat later, so I don't mind gouging into it now. I carefully remove the packaging so the juices don't leak out. I usually pat it down with a paper towel, but this one didn't have much liquid on it. I put the brisket in the freezer for about an hour before I start trimming so the fat is hard, which makes it easier to trim. I also start trimming on the fat side when the fat is the coldest. I then inspect the brisket to see what I'm working with. Starting on the fat side, I'll trim off the mohawk. You can leave it on if you want to, but I like to trim it off. That's because it will likely dry out and prevent the areas around it from developing a nice dark bark. Grab the mohawk and pull it up so it's easier to cut off. I'll then square off that long side and remove some of the fat under the mohawk. That flat corner needs to be rounded off because it was really thin and will just dry out during the cook. I see that it's still too thin and take off a bit more. I flip it over and start working on the other side. I remove all the brown meat and fat and square it off. I also round off that corner, but just a little bit because it's nice and thick on that side. I inspect things again and see that I'd like to remove some of the meat from the point. You don't have to do this, but I like to use that section in burgers and sausage. Also, the way it's sticking out will likely cause it to dry out anyway. I rub my fingers between the mohawk and the hump to see how deep the fat runs between the two, so I have an idea of how much more I should trim off each side. I see more fat than I like on the mohawk side, so I trim that off. I then decide to flatten out that side even more. My goal is a uniform shape on both sides so it cooks evenly. I'm now going to trim down the hump side by working from the middle of the point to the side. I'm only taking off small slivers of fat at a time. I trim a little and then poke to see how hard the fat is and then trim a little more. I'm shooting for about a 1/4 inch fat here. Don't trim too much at once or you'll likely expose the meat. You want a layer of fat on that side without it being too thick. If it's too thick, it won't render well during the cook. I'm then going to get to work on the slope fat. That's the fat between the point and the flat. I also trim down the flat's fat cap. Again, I'm cutting a sliver at a time and checking under my knife to make sure I'm not cutting into the meat. If I do end up cutting into meat, then I'll angle my knife upwards to minimize the gouge. Sometimes I'll switch to my 4-inch knife to get some of the awkward angles. There's a bit too much fat here, so I'll trim that down and clean up that corner. I then take a minute to inspect the whole fat side and see if anything else needs to be cleaned up. I flip it over to the meat side and remove the decal fat first. Just grab it with your left hand and then carve it out by making small cuts between the fat and the meat, working your way to the side and remove it completely. I then clean up the underside of the point. Anything that's brown or funky looking has to go. I switch back to my 10-inch slicer and remove the pockets of fat from the flat muscle. I'll put my left hand under the brisket so it bends a little, making it easier to cut. All of these cuts are with the grain to help minimize the amount of meat that comes off. You just want to trim fat, not muscle here. This brisket came with a little gash on the meat side here, so I just level that off. I inspect things again and round off the flat a little bit. I then flip it over to the fat side and level off that gash. I'm poking the fat here and notice it's a bit harder than I like, so I trim that down a little bit more. I do my final inspection and call this one good. Let me know in the comments if you like these slower walkthrough type videos, and feel free to join my Patreon where you can get one-on-one help with me and the rest of the community.